When pushing the limits, we often realize that we might have gone too far.
And this is exactly the story of the KTM 950 Rally. A monster, a technical marvel, the fastest motorcycle the Dakar Rally will ever see.
And one of the greatest stories in the motorcycling world. It's a roller coaster of emotions. It's about people, racers, families, tragedies, and legacy.
Buckle up, turn on the TV and grab some popcorn, because this is one of the greatest tales I'll ever get to tell. It all started in the early 90s, 10 years before the 950 name became relevant.
Two engineering students demised this weird contraption using two KTM LC4 cylinders stuck together to a special crankcase. This was a prototype built for track racing, for a German series called Battle of the Twins. That year, KTM did actually display this prototype on the floors of IFMA in Cologne, in a street legalized version.
But, you see, that prototype was unbaked, to say the least. I mean, the Bipono team that created it had something there, but it was just that, an early stage prototype. I mean, heck, it didn't even feature an electric starter.
And the biggest problem? It was the timing. Look, early 90s wasn't a bright time for KTM. They simply didn't have the funds to take this project on. They tried talking to Rotax to use one of their engines as a baseline, yet that fell through. They also turned to Folan, another engine manufacturer, yet the outcome was the same. And so, as many great ideas go, this one had to be buried.
Maybe buried is the wrong term here. You see, KTM did really want to pursue building a big twin. That idea never slipped out of their minds. They just had to put it to rest for a while. And, well, in 1998, after some internal restructuring, they could finally restart the project.
But this time, they were going to do it right. All the R&D would happen in-house. Big teams and funds were allocated to the 950 project. And they started moving fast. Just a year later, they managed to do the first dyno run on this experimental platform. And just a bit later, at the dawn of the new millennium, with the help of their design partner company, Kiska, they released the first concept of the 950 Adventure.
And the public? They absolutely hated it. With passion. I can see why. I mean, just look at it. But more importantly, KTM managed to see past that. You see, the press didn't hate the internals, the construction, they simply hated the design. And that's fixable as long as you have a good platform underneath.
But how do you develop such a platform? You turn to a simple yet crazy Italian, Fabrizio Meoni. They would give him full input on everything related to chassis, suspension, engine, brakes. Anything Meoni said was sacred to KTM.
Wait, who was this Fabrizio Meoni guy? Why was he so important? Well, this is where the real story starts. Because Fabrizio wasn't just a guy, just a racer. And his story shaped the 950 as we know it.
It's 1957, the last day of the year. A young Fabrizio is born in Tuscany. That date, the 31st of December, rarely people might recognize it.
E proprio nella data di nascita è segnato il suo destino. È l'ultimo giorno dell'anno che parte la Parigi-Dakar.
It's like the universe was already hinting at the future. And so, a few decades later, Fabrizio takes on his first Dakar conquest. And he absolutely smashes it, coming in 12th as a privateer, the highest ranked privateer on his first shot at it.
In '94, he beats his own result, coming in third on a privateer Honda. And it wasn't just that he was a privateer, his bike was severely underpowered compared to the twin-cylinder factory bikes he was up against.
In 1998, he gets close to winning the Dakar. But that year, the rally organizers introduced a new GPS-based navigation system. And well, let's just say reliability wasn't one of its perks, and this reliability made Fabrizio lose the chance to get the title.
Merda! Maledetti! Basta! Maledetti GPS di merda! 2 GPS!
You see, Meoni was an incredible racer, but he lived and breathed the African desert. It wasn't just a job for him, this was his entire life.
2001. A year that ended on a low note for the world, but in the beginning of it, Fabrizio was going to write history.
Alcuni sono a caccia della vittoria di tappa, a me non interessa, mi interessa l'arrivo a Dakar senza problemi.
That mentality is exactly what brought Fabrizio to the top, with his two close rivals crashing out and having mechanical issues. Indeed, in order to finish first, you first have to finish, and he did it.
Vai moto, vai! Forza moto! Non mi tradire! 5 chilometri ancora! Poi la liberazione! Eccolo lì all'arrivo! Eccolo!
His first ever Dakar win and KTM's first ever Dakar win too. He was a hero, and not just for his wife and son Joelle, but for an entire Italy.
You see, 2002 was the year when the 950 story and the Meoni story really come together and form an unbreakable bond.
For this year, KTM had a wild dream. A dream of building the fastest rally motorcycle that ever existed.
And so the 950 rally prototype came to life. Initially they did a couple test runs in Tunisia, and they went so well they signed up for the Rally de Pharaons, which Fabrizio won.
And so there was only one mountain left to climb. But you see, you have to realize what type of animal this 950 rally really was. It was crazy, wild, even by today's standards.
Thanks to some info from a person named Barbasma on KTM950.info, we have more details on what this prototype actually looked like.
The 950 was a big bike, no way around it. And so Meoni wanted to take as much weight off the front end as possible, and he took that to an extreme. That's why the oil tank and battery were moved under the seat. The forks laid deep inside the triple clamps to try and shift the center of gravity as much to the rear as possible. The skid plate was made from carbon fiber, again in order to get closer to this unorthodox weight distribution.
Remember, this was back in 2002, and you think that's crazy? That's just the beginning of it. The initial prototype of the 950 was considered too low for Meoni.
So they custom built a suspension setup with 330 millimeters of travel. Look, the whole prototype was hand built, fully custom. The crankcase vent stood above the drive chain so that any excess oil would spill onto the chain, thus lubricating it. Allegedly, the rear tanks were hand built by some guy in Italy. The rear subframe was made out of titanium.
And then there's the 950 engine. When the standard bike launched a few years after with 95 horsepower, people were amazed. Well, this rally one, it apparently had close to 135 horsepower.
And this actually created some big problems because that was just too much for the rear tires. Seriously, putting all that grunt to the ground meant that during its life, the 950 rally managed to blow the tires apart on some long and fast stages.
It was an animal, so ridiculous by any stretch of the imagination. And it was simply huge.
But it was Meoni's child. He poured all his heart and soul into the project, and it was a bike really meant for him.
Paul Kraus, the last man to ever ride the big twin in the Dakar Rally, said that
they were really racing. Meoni rode his 950 like it was a 125. He would just spin it over blind dunes. It was crazy.
And this was all Meoni's doing. Some people did get the opportunity to ride this beast a few years later, like Jimmy Lewis for Cycle World magazine.
It's fun to dream of riding bikes like this, but there's a reason they're not sold at the local dealership.
And so this monster came to life, and it was ready to take on the ultimate challenge, the Dakar Rally.
This year, 2002, would be a truly defining year for the world's greatest rally. In a way, it's the year when everything changed, and the 950 was the catalyst for everything.
But when the Dakar started, Meoni wasn't exactly feeling it. He was falling behind, some people were starting to doubt him and the 950 Stallion. But you see, Meoni is one of the greatest for many reasons, and he knew how to play the long game.
He knew that the real race would start deep inside Africa. That's where things got decided. And when he got to his familiar sand tracks, Meoni started dominating and catching up to the leaders. And so it all came down to the last proper stage.
Questa gara è una gara che si vince anche navigando, cioè trovando la pista giusta.
Between him and Nani Roma stood just 3 minutes. In Dakar terms, they were basically on equal footing. But Meoni had a problem. He had to start first.
Wait, isn't that usually a good thing in racing, to start first? Well, in Dakar, it's not really a gift, it's a bit of a curse. Here's the thing, Dakar is just as much about speed as it is about navigation.
And one of the biggest advantages a rider can have is tracks to follow, because then you can focus less on navigating and more on riding fast. But if you're the first to start, there is no track to follow, and you end up losing a ton of time to your second place follower. And Fabrizio knew this.
If you're going to follow anybody, follow Meoni. Everyone knew that, and they did.
They don't call him King of the Desert for nothing. So what Meoni did after starting was brilliant. He tried to take routes that were parallel to the correct track, but slightly off the road.
Astutamente si è portato via dalla pista senza lasciare la traccia, ha preso la pista giusta sul cap giusto.
Isn't that slower, you might ask? Well, it is. But this last stage featured some incredibly difficult navigation features. And Meoni was an ace of navigation. So, by riding off the track, what he did was he left little to no tracks for Nani to follow.
He bet his entire rally on one thing, on the fact that he could find the way, but Nani couldn't. Yet this would only work if Nani didn't see Meoni's tracks. And well, it worked spectacularly.
This was the crucial error he made. Down he went into a stony bowl. And this was one place he was never going to get out of. And the rally and the lead were going away from him. The tension was rising. He couldn't escape, and panic set in. 473 kilometers of this stage between Tichit and Kiefer. We found the Spaniard, and unfortunately for him, we watched his problems unfold.
Not only did Nani Roma get lost, he actually crashed out while trying to find the correct track.
Eventually he could take no more. Roma, victim of a panic attack, he was out of the rally.
It was a masterpiece of a move, one that only a genius like Fabrizio could come up with.
Well, that left the way clear for Meoni to lead the bikes home on the shores of Lac Rose and victory.
And so, the Dakar Rally in 2002 was won by Fabrizio Meoni on a twin-cylinder KTM 950. And not only did he win it, he did so by 47 minutes ahead of Alfie Cox, the runner-up. It was an incredible showing, both by his 950 rally and by the King of the Desert himself.
I said that 2002 was a defining year for the Dakar, but it was so for multiple reasons. You see, the rallying world had a problem, a big one.
You have to understand, during those years, the motorcycle landscape was weird. Some people raced on twins, some on single-cylinder motorcycles. Some raced on 950s, some on 600s. And by 2004, KTM only had 2 big twins taking part in the Dakar Rally.
But the problem that these 950s started was they were simply too fast.
When he won the 2002 Dakar, Fabrizio had an average speed of 105 km per hour. That's almost 10 km per hour faster than the winner of the 2003 rally on a single-cylinder KTM.
In fact, this average speed was only beaten 20 years after by Sam Sunderland. And even crazier, in 2003, before retiring from the competition,
Meoni completed the 13th stage of Dakar on the 950 with an average speed of 128 km per hour. Over 570 kilometers. For reference, from what I found, this was the highest average speed ever recorded during a stage. Indeed, the 950 rally was the fastest motorcycle to ever enter the Dakar.
And most likely, it will always stay as the fastest bike to race the dunes. This data was found on whip.live, which is a website built by Fabrizio's son, Joele. And keep tight, because this is not the last time you'll be hearing his name.
But back to Dakar's problem, this was getting out of hand. Bikes were too big and too fast. The organization tried making the track slower, twistier, but that only did so much.
The problem is, speed is one thing, but crashing a 200 kilo plus machine, even at lower speeds, is most likely fatal. The room for error was rapidly approaching zero.
That's why in 2005 the rally banned all twin cylinders above 450cc, practically banning the twins altogether. A year later they also tried limiting the fuel capacities from 50 liters down to 30.
Which kind of backfired, since this made all bikes 20 kilograms lighter, which made them faster again. And this all culminated in the 450cc limit imposed in 2011 that we're all familiar with.
In a way, 2005 marks the end of the KTM 950 rally. It was simply too much, too big, too powerful, too hard to tame.
But unfortunately, 2005 was going to be one of the most tragic years, not just in Dakar history, but for rallying in general.
Less than 4 months before the start of the Dakar, another KTM pilot, Richard Sainz, had a bad accident which took his life. After that, teammates Fabrizio and Cyril Depre made a pact.
Ci siamo detti che sia Fabrizio che sia io. Ci deve essere una moto blu, visto che abbiamo delle KTM con i colori della Gauloise, quindi blu. Abbiamo detto che una moto blu doveva arrivare prima, a rendere omaggio a Richard.
And the 2005 Dakar was even more important for Fabrizio, as according to him, that would have been his last.
He had promised his family to stop racing afterwards, to spend more time with his wife, his little boy and his 2-year-old daughter.
È una gara dura, è una gara anche pericolosa, non si può nascondere, alla fine è quello il motivo principale.
It would have been a perfect ending to his career. Stage 7 was the beginning of the end. Amateur rider José Manuel Pérez crashed out of the race and had to be airlifted to the hospital. Unfortunately, a few days later, his life would end in the same hospital, not being able to fight off all the injuries sustained.
Morale wasn't high, and so we get to stage 11.
Siamo arrivati su una collinetta, poi c'era una piccola vallata. Quando arriviamo sulla collina, io vedo una pista. La trovo io per primo. Allora imbocco la pista. Guardo Fabrizio, gli faccio un cenno con la testa per vedere. Ho trovato la pista, vado avanti io. 50 km dopo mi giro e non vedo più nessuno. Allora mi dico, merda. Mi sono messo su una pista ma non è quella giusta.
The track Cyril found was the right one, but Fabrizio was nowhere to be seen. 11:15 local time. Fabrizio crashes after a fuel stop, suddenly halting his progress. Remember how I said bikes were too heavy? A couple minutes later, Alfie, Cox and David Fretinier arrive on the scene, finding Fabrizio laying a few meters next to his bike, unconscious. At 11:36 local time, a helicopter arrives on scene. The paramedics immediately start their resuscitation effort. Meoni's heart wasn't beating at the time the medical team arrived.
(11:21). After 45 minutes of trying, the paramedics have to stop. Fabrizio Meoni is declared deceased. Official cause of death, cardiac arrest, although he did suffer severe cervical spine damage. Everybody was in shock. They couldn't process what was happening, and how could you?
Meoni was more than a racer, he was a friend to the entire paddock. Everyone's morale was down in the toilet and all riders unanimously decided not to race the following stage.
In honour of Meoni, the 12th stage was cancelled for the bikes and the field was airlifted from Kiffer in Mauritania to Bamako in Mali.
That year, Cyril Depre took the victory, one of the most bittersweet ones of his career.
Sure, he took the pact he had done earlier with Fabrizio to the finish line. A blue KTM did win the rally, but at what cost?
I mean, KTM as a company, after losing two of their riders half a year apart, started seriously contemplating retiring from the sport altogether.
It's very difficult to accept what has happened. I believe it's not just bad luck. There is something. Several months ago it was Richard, yesterday Carney, and today Fabrizio. There is something other than bad luck.
Bob Bergman was doing his first ever Dakar back in 2005, and according to eatsleepride.com, he said,
"As the pumpist filled the tanks, I turned to another rider in line and said, 'That was horrible.' He said, 'It is a very bad day. Fabrizio Meoni is dead.' I couldn't believe my ears. I was in shock. I left my bike where it was and walked a few steps into the desert and started to cry. This was getting out of control. It wasn't worth it anymore. We were going through hell and people were dying. For what? To prove that we were tough? This was pointless."
Fabrizio was more than just a racer, than a desert king. He was a great human before anything. The organization team called him as one of the greatest rally champions of all time.
He was a tactical racer. Sure, he had the speed, but he had so much more. He lived and breathed the African desert.
Non come è morto tragicamente, diceva, se devo morire, ma anche bruscamente, dice, in Africa.
It's very difficult to talk about Fabrizio. He was a very modest person with a very big heart and a talented rider. He was the major force with his hometown Castiglione in Florence in Italy, behind the building of a school in Dakar. It was a project that at the beginning was only for a few children, but then he realized that these people needed more help because they had so much less than we had.
He always said that
L'Africa mi ha dato tanto e io devo restituire l'Africa.
That's why his foundation continued to build schools and help kids in Africa. Everyone loved Fabrizio. In fact, his drummer friend of the famous Italian pop band Mattia Bazar wrote an entire song in honor of him, Warriors in the Sun.
contrary to popular belief, Fabrizio didn't actually lose his life on a KTM 950 rally. By 2005, these big twins were already outlawed.
I tried separating the two stories, and yet I couldn't. Because what later became the 950 adventure is deeply tied to Fabrizio's passion and story.
That's how this adventure bike at launch became the most capable big bore ADV on the market. It was innovative with its powerful yet feather-light engine. It's how the dual front tank design came to be. In a way, just like Fabrizio's 950 rally, the publicly accessible adventure model was a tamed wolf,
While the BMW GS of that time was a dressed-up Labrador. You know which one is cooler,
but you also know which one can bite first. And all that came from Meoni's philosophy. And that's what made it a real icon.
And then there's the design of it. When I was a kid, I remember watching the Dakar rally on TV at my grandparents' house after coming back from school. I remember seeing these bikes. I didn't understand much, but I was fascinated. You see, back then, if you asked me to draw my dream motorcycle, this is what I would draw. All based on the bikes I saw racing at Dakar. It took me 20 years to realize that this fantasy motorcycle I dreamed of as a kid, it was always the KTM 950 rally.
In 2005, Fabrizio Meoni's story came to an end. The KTM 950 got to live a few more years, then converged into the 990, and the rest is history. That's how these stories ended.
Except they didn't. Earlier I told you to remember a name, Gioele Meoni, Fabrizio's son. Well, it turns out that the end of that story was just the beginning of another.
You see, in 1994, when Gioele was free, his father, through the power of Santa, gifted him his first motorcycle. 7 years later, when Fabrizio first stepped up on the top spot of the podium in Dakar, Gioele's mom told the kid to join his father up there.
It was a very emotional moment, both for father and son.
He would tell me to do what I really wanted. I shouldn't do anything to try and imitate him. He'd say, "When you'll be 18, I'll be retired. I'll no longer be competing. And maybe we can do the Dakar together, father and son. To do the Dakar like the one I had planned with my father. When I wanted to do it with him, the idea was doing it like friends, father-son, without a mechanic, without anything.
That's why in 2024, Joele signed up for the Dakar in the Male Moto class. To convince his mother and wife, he had to promise them to never look at the standings. This was an effort to finish, and that was enough.
And finish he did, just earlier this year. The goal was to complete the Dakar, but more importantly,
la moto con la quale correrò la Dakar del 2024 venga poi venduta all'asta e con il ricavato poi andare a aiutare la costruzione di una scuola nella periferia di Dakar che sarà intitolata a nome di mia sorella Chiara, che è scomparsa l'anno scorso.
You see, Joele was stepping into his father's footsteps because, above all, Fabrizio was a great human. These are two great stories from the motorcycling world. Stories that are so different, yet so closely tied together.
One is the story of a prototype, of a bold move, but also a story of going too far. On the other hand, the Meoni side is the story of a great rider. But more than that, of a great man. A true role model, one that will live in the minds of people on the same pedestal as the greats.
Without him, we would have never had the 950 as we know it. Even more importantly though, Fabrizio wrote history. And when I say that, I don't just mean motorcycling history, but history for hundreds of kids in Senegal and other bits in Africa. And it's a flag that seems to be carried on by his son, Joele Meoni.